The clock struck midnight, yet John's flight landed early. The house was unusually still when he arrived. No lights, no faint hum of the television Mary often left on. Just silence. A kind of silence that carried weight. He paused at the doorway, his suitcase resting beside him, and took a deep breath. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Upstairs, Mary sat in the dim glow of their bedroom, her face unreadable. The air around her was heavy with something unspoken. She didn't flinch when he entered, her eyes fixed on the empty wall ahead as though searching for something that wasn't there. "You're home," she said flatly, her voice devoid of the warmth it once carried. But before John could respond, his gaze landed on the objects scattered on the bed: leather straps, a camera, and a USB drive. His chest tightened as an unfamiliar chill coursed through him. "Mary," he began, the weight in his voice a reflection of the growing dread in his chest. "What is this?" Her eyes flicked to him then, hollow and piercing. "Do you remember the promise we made before our wedding, John?" Her voice was calm, but her words were a blade carving through the air. "That we'd never betray each other? That if one of us did, there'd be consequences?" He stared at her, confusion mingling with fear. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't," but she cut him off with a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Don't insult me by pretending." She reached for the USB drive, holding it up as if it were evidence in a trial. "I know, John. Everything." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in. "Mary," he said, his voice trembling now, "whatever you think you know, it's not true. Please." But she wasn't listening. Her voice cracked as she continued, each word laced with venom and heartbreak. "I made you a promise, John. And I kept it. You'll see." The scene shifted. John's world unraveled as he watched the footage. The man on the screen wasn't him. His wife's betrayal played out like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. "Why?" His voice was barely audible, his hands trembling as he reached for her. "Why would you do this?" Her answer was cold. "Because I thought you did it to me first." It was then that the first seed of doubt took root in her mind. Had she been wrong? But pride, that cruel master, wouldn't let her falter. She crossed her arms, defiant even in her uncertainty. "Little did I know, John, that every choice we made would only lead us further from the love we once shared." As the hours passed, John pieced together his alibi, presented her with undeniable proof of his innocence. And though the facts stared her in the face, Mary refused to look. She clung to the betrayal she thought she'd endured, too blinded by anger to see the truth before her. That night, as John packed a bag and turned to leave, he paused in the doorway of their bedroom. His voice broke as he said, "I loved you, Mary. I would have given you everything. But this isn't love. This is war." And with that, he was gone. Little did Mary know that her war wasn't over. It had just begun. Mary stood at the precipice of a shattered life, clutching to the remnants of her decisions with a mixture of defiance and despair. John's departure had left a vacuum, one she filled not with reflection, but with determination to salvage what little remained of their marriage. It was not love that drove her now. No, love had long since been buried beneath the rubble of pride and vengeance. What propelled her forward was the fear of being the villain in her own story. Laura, her lawyer, a woman of sharp intellect and cooler temperament, listened with measured silence as Mary recounted the events that had led her here. There was a weariness in Laura's eyes, a hesitation born not from doubt in Mary's intentions, but from the moral quicksand upon which she now stood. Representing Mary meant condoning the indefensible, yet refusing would leave her without a lifeline. In Laura, Mary sought redemption, or at least a chance to rewrite the ending. And so, with reluctant counsel, Mary proposed couples therapy, a desperate attempt to piece together what she had so carelessly torn apart. But John, once the man who vowed to weather any storm with her, had changed. Revenge had hardened him, made him see Mary not as a partner, but as an adversary in a cruel game they had both played too far. He refused her offer outright, the bitterness in his voice echoing in her mind long after he walked away. The rejection stung, not for the loss of reconciliation, but for the finality it symbolized. Mary could feel the world slipping from her grasp, but her resolve only deepened. She would not lose, not to John, not to the consequences of her own making. Yet, unbeknownst to her, John's silence harbored plans of his own, and those plans were merciless. When the video surfaced, Mary was unprepared. It reached places she never imagined, her father's stoic eyes fixed on the screen, her sister's voice cracking with disappointment, her once proud family fractured under the weight of her actions. The man she had once called her husband wielded the footage like a weapon, and with each revelation, Mary felt herself shrinking. Her father's words, sharp, unyielding, haunted her. "How could you?" they said, though no voice needed to speak them aloud. Yet John was only beginning. His revenge unfolded with the precision of a masterful tactician, each step designed to strip away everything Mary held dear. The video found its way into her workplace, where once friendly colleagues averted their eyes and whispers filled the halls. Dismissal came swiftly, and with it, the financial stability she had taken for granted. Mark, the man who had shared her betrayal, faced his own reckoning as his marriage dissolved in the wake of John's revelations. Mary stood amidst the ruins of her choices, watching as John's vengeance consumed her world. He was relentless, sending the video to her church, to friends who once stood by her, to neighbors who once smiled in passing. The isolation was suffocating. Everywhere she turned, she met judgment, disdain, or the deafening silence of abandonment. The woman she had been, the wife, the daughter, the friend, was gone, replaced by a pariah clinging to the edges of a life she no longer recognized. Despair seeped into the corners of her being, a shadow she could not escape. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its walls echoing with the absence of forgiveness. Mary withdrew her request for reconciliation, not out of choice, but out of necessity. There was nothing left to salvage, no bridge unburned. She signed the papers, the ink marking the end of a union she had destroyed with her own hands. And yet, even in the quiet moments of surrender, Mary was not free. Regret clawed at her, memories of the love they once shared flashing before her eyes. She thought of the promises they made, the laughter that once filled their home, and the night she had allowed suspicion to consume her. The realization was crushing. She had traded trust for vengeance, and in doing so, lost everything that mattered. But Mary was not alone in her suffering. John, too, wrestled with his own demons. Though he had won this war, victory brought him no peace. The man he had become, calculating, unyielding, was a stranger even to himself. He had destroyed Mary, yes, but in doing so, he had also destroyed the love that once defined them. Revenge had left him hollow, a man standing amidst ashes with no one to blame but himself. In the wreckage of their shared lives, Mary and John stood as reflections of one another, two souls consumed by pride, undone by the very emotions they once claimed as love. And as Mary faced the silence of her empty home, and John the solitude of his victories, one question lingered in the air between them, unspoken but ever present: could either of them ever find redemption in the aftermath? The final threads of their shared lives unraveled slowly, each tug revealing the depths of their wounds. Months had passed since the storm of revenge, and though time had dulled the sharpest edges of their pain, it had not brought healing. For Mary, every moment was a confrontation with what she had become. For John, each day was an exercise in trying to rebuild a life without the foundation he once believed unshakable. They met one last time, not in the intimacy of their once shared home, but in the sterile, clinical setting of a lawyer's office. Mary arrived first, clutching her trembling hands together, her face a mixture of weariness and fragile hope. She had replayed this moment endlessly in her mind, crafting and recrafting words that might undo even a fraction of the damage she had caused. But now, as she sat waiting, her thoughts were a tangle of guilt and desperation. She no longer sought to reclaim the life they had lost, she knew that was beyond her grasp. Instead, she yearned for forgiveness, for an acknowledgement that she was more than her worst mistakes. John entered with a demeanor that was equal parts composed and distant. The months apart had hardened him further, yet beneath the surface was a man burdened by his own choices. He had achieved what he set out to do. Mary's life was in ruins. But standing there, facing the woman who had once been his world, he could not deny the hollowness of his victory. Love, even when shattered, had left its indelible mark. The lawyer read through the formalities, her voice a monotone that neither truly heard. For them, this was not about contracts or settlements, it was about closure. As the papers were signed, Mary found her voice, a quiet plea breaking through the tension. She spoke of regret, of the unbearable weight of knowing she had destroyed what they once shared. She asked for forgiveness, not as a wife, not as the woman who had betrayed him, but as a person trying to salvage a shred of humanity from the wreckage. But John, though moved by her words, could not offer what she sought. His wounds ran too deep, his trust too thoroughly broken. Forgiveness, he told himself, was not something he could give, not now, and perhaps not ever. Yet even in his refusal, there was a flicker of recognition. He saw the woman before him not as an enemy, but as someone who had lost her way, just as he had. As he left that office, the door closing behind him felt like the final chapter of their story. But John knew better than to believe in neat endings. The love they had shared, the pain they had caused, it would follow them both, a shadow stretching far beyond this moment. For Mary, the aftermath was a slow descent into solitude. Her days were marked by the absence of connection, her nights by the echoes of what could have been. She walked through the streets of her town like a ghost, invisible yet all too aware of the whispers that followed her. Her family, though divided in their judgments, offered no solace. Her church, once a sanctuary, had become a place of silent condemnation. And yet, amidst the isolation, Mary found herself reflecting deeply on the choices that had brought her here. She saw, with painful clarity, the woman she had been, proud, vengeful, blind to her own flaws. John, too, found little comfort in the life he had rebuilt. The act of tearing Mary down had left him with nothing to build upon. His nights were restless, haunted by memories of her laughter, her touch, the small, intimate moments that once defined their marriage. He tried to move on, to find solace in work, in friends, even in fleeting romantic encounters. But each effort felt hollow, a reminder that the man he had become was not the man he wanted to be. Their paths crossed once more, though neither planned it. It was at the grocery store, a mundane place for such a charged encounter. Mary, with her shoulders hunched and her eyes cast downward, looked up to find John standing a few feet away. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Neither spoke, but in their shared glance was a universe of unspoken words, sorrow, regret, longing, and an unnameable ache that neither could fully articulate. And then, just as quickly, the moment passed. John turned away, and Mary resumed her task. But the encounter lingered in both their minds, a reminder that some connections, no matter how damaged, could never truly be severed. As the days turned into years, Mary began to rebuild, not her reputation or her relationships, but herself. She volunteered at shelters, spent hours in quiet reflection, and slowly, painfully, began to forgive herself. She understood now that forgiveness from John might never come, and that was a burden she would carry. But she also understood that redemption was not about erasing the past, it was about learning to live with it. John, too, found his own path to healing. It was not linear, nor was it easy. But over time, he began to let go of the anger that had consumed him. He didn't forget, nor did he entirely forgive, but he learned to live with the scars. And in their own separate ways, both Mary and John came to see that love, though capable of great destruction, was also the seed of resilience. In the end, their story was not one of reconciliation, but of survival. They were two people forever changed by each other, bound not by the life they shared, but by the lessons they carried forward. And though the question of forgiveness remained unanswered, both had come to understand that some wounds, while never fully healing, could still teach the value of moving forward.